So, hello everyone. Thank you
Hi.
so much for joining us. And thank you to the IIC for hosting this book launch. It's been a long journey for this book. I conceived of it in April 2018, and more on that in a moment. But what I want to stress is that it's been 2.5 years from conception to fruition. And so much has changed in the world since then. Most obviously, the googly of a year that 2020 has turned out to be. Cranes soar, they cross borders, but this year has been one of stasis, of traveling inwards perhaps rather than spreading our wings and sallying forth. And yet, and I am sort of devastated by this yet. In other ways, nothing has changed, or at least not in the direction that would make this book any less relevant. When I announced it publicly, when I announced this book launch publicly a few weeks ago, I was flooded with comments about its timeliness. But it's been 2.5 years since I woke up one morning in the Japanese city of Hiroshima to news of the confinement in a temple, gang rape, and murder of an 8-year-old girl, Asifa Banu, and sort of felt stripped of hope, of faith, and even of words. I write a little bit about that moment in my introductory piece to this volume, and I will read a couple of paragraphs from it. I was accustomed to digesting news of rapes along with breakfast toast, to imbibing images of death with my Demerara sweetened coffee. But this time, my body revolted, and I'm not sure why. There were always so many atrocities in competition. If I could not be equally outraged by every brutality, and we seemed to have such a wellspring of these, was it fair to be outraged by any one? And yet, on the day that I read about how Asifa Banu was sedated, violated, bludgeoned, and choked, my usual reaction to events like this, which was horror but comfortingly underlain by an awareness of its own ephemerality, this reaction was supplanted by a dense weight that I feared would never lift. Asifa had sparkling eyes. She had ponytails and an impish smile. On the day she was taken, she'd been out grazing her family's horses in a meadow. She was wearing a purple dress. A man had beckoned her into a forest, and because she was a child, and children tend to trust and obey adults, she followed him. She was then force fed drugs, dragged to a nearby temple, and locked in. And over the next few days, she was raped again and again by multiple men, including the temple priest and a number of police officers. She was starved, beaten, and eventually strangled. I didn't speak about what I'd read about Asifa Banu with my family because, in some ways, as an Indian, I felt somehow contaminated by the news. I felt complicit, guilty. That morning, we as a family visited the Peace Park Memorial in Hiroshima. Um, it was a museum that was dedicated to the victims of the 1945 nuclear bombing of the city, in which up to 80,000 people had died instantaneously. I learned that the heat that was generated by the blast had been so intense that there had been hundreds of people who had simply evaporated, they had disappeared, vaporized. At the Memorial Museum, my boys and I walked around, taking in many of the exhibits. And I remember seeing one that was titled School Trousers. It was a wretchedly tattered pair of trousers that had belonged to a child called Naoki Mikami, who had been attending morning assembly in his schoolyard at the moment of the explosion. We went and saw another one of the exhibits, which was called White Wall Stained with Black Rain. The black rain, I learned, was basically radioactive dust and soot mixed with water vapor that fell on Hiroshima soon after the bomb had been detonated. But then, as we walked around, we came across two simple, childlike paper cranes, which was startlingly defiant. They were gentle, but at the same time, viscerally powerful as the other artifacts. And to me, they seemed to both acknowledge the horror of what had gone down, but simultaneously to refuse their ugliness. These were, of course, not the first origami cranes that I had seen in the city, because Hiroshima, as a city, was festooned with skeins of cranes hanging in front of virtually every facade, from office blocks and hotels to the front of restaurants. School children around the world folded millions of these birds and sent them to the city every year. The origins of this global flight of paper cranes lies in the story of another little girl called Sadoko Sasaki, who had been 2 years old at the time of the Hiroshima bombing. But she survived the bombing. Not for long, however. Within 10 years, she had died of radiation related leukemia. But while she was sick at the hospital, Sadako had desperately folded origami paper cranes in hopes of a reprieve, because there was a legend in Japan that whoever manages to fold 1,000 paper cranes will have their wishes granted. So the young girl folded and folded, but her strength gave out and she died. And yet her cranes, they did take wing. And they have since emerged as a symbol of apology, of healing, of resistance, of renewal in the face of devastation, of atonement for the horrors that we have inflicted on our own, and of warning that we must remember, lest we not repeat. They may have come out of Japan's own particular mythology and history, but they do not belong to any single country. For the crane is a migratory bird, and it crosses borders and it makes its home with scant regard to the sort of blood soaked lines that humans draw on maps. So then I had a thought just when I had felt stripped, as I said earlier, of hope, that perhaps I would not give up. I would not give up on India. I would not allow myself to be felled by hatred, and that I would fight as best as I could using the weapons at my disposal, which were words and cranes. Back in Tokyo from Hiroshima, I began to post pictures of paper cranes on social media, and I made a video asking people to fold these cranes as a gesture of defiance, as an act of reclamation. To me, as I'm sure to many, hopefully all of you, India is not just a territory. It is an idea, and it is an idea that asserts and even celebrates multiplicity. Like most Indians, I am a mongrel. I am a mishmash, a cocktail, shaken and stirred, a Delhiite and an English speaker, half a Tamilian, half a UP Wali, a Hindu culturally, an atheist by choice, a Muslim by heritage. But the sum of all of these things is greater than the parts. I'm an Indian. This India, my India, your India, it was besieged, but it still lived. And people responded to my appeal for cranes, sending me pictures of cranes they folded from Chennai and Delhi, Hong Kong, Pune, Bangalore, California, Mumbai, Tokyo, Beijing, Jakarta, you name it. And it was at that point that my friend, the literary agent and crane folder, Bangalore based Jayapriya Vasudevan, suggested that perhaps I try and do a book that would use the paper crane as a motif of connection, so that those of us who worked with words and fought with words could reach out to each other and sort of form a shared civic space, and become the best army, the best resistance that we could be. We found a receptive publisher in the somewhat serendipitously named Seagull books, because how could a seagull refuse a crane, right? But I wrote to friends and acquaintances and total strangers whose work I admired to persuade them to come on board. And I have to say that this was a labor of love for everyone involved. There was no financial recompense in what are tough times financially for everyone and also for writers. And I received an overwhelming response. It took about a year to corral and collect and edit everyone's contributions, but my heart soared as high as any crane's while working on this collection. The final 23 pieces encompass reportage and stories, poems, memoirs, comedy, polemic. Really, I think the kind of complex and enriching diversity that India demands and deserves. Most of the pieces were written in English, but we did have contributions from poets who write in Kashmiri, in Oriya, and in Bengali. What connects each of the pieces is the paper crane. In some of the pieces, the cranes are like Easter eggs. They're sort of hidden away from sight. Their meaning perhaps in need of some excavation. In others, they are upfront and center. I'm joined here today at the launch of this book by three of the contributors, Salil Tripathi, Jonathan Gil Harris Gill, and Natasha Badhwar, all of whom have written memoirs of sorts, but with a kind of rare power and luminosity, characteristics that I think they share with many of the other pieces as well. I'd like to draw the three of them into a conversation now, and perhaps start off the discussion today with Salil, very senior journalist and chair of PEN International Writers in Prisons Committee. I and all of us really owe him a big debt of gratitude for joining us from New York at what is 5:30 a.m. his time. We'd calculated it as 6:30 a.m. but hadn't accounted for daylight saving and the change of clocks. Now, Salil is a self-confessed lover of early mornings, but I think even by his standards, 5:30 a.m. is quite a heroic effort. So thank you very, very much, Salil. If I could, I'd like to start by asking you to recall for me what your reaction was when you first received my email asking you to join this project. What was it, what about it spoke to you?
I think the novelty of the idea, first of all. By the way, I mean, these days we are not sleeping in America, as you know, with the election results coming. So I mean, 5:30 is probably the end of a very long night in a way. But anyway, I have a good cup of coffee by me, and thank you so much for this session, and lovely to see familiar faces here. I think what struck me and what I found interesting about it was the novelty of the idea, because what had happened, as you said, was outrageous in its extremity. But if you look deeper into it, it was a continuation of a pattern that began with the lynching of Muhammad Akhlaq and other cases of people being burnt alive, the killings of M.M. Kalburgi and Gauri Lankesh and Dabholkar. Sequentially, I may be going wrong in this, but it's the idea of the many or the majoritarian imposing upon the minority or the few what they think is right. And it's a much abused word now, liberal, the liberal exasperation, what we do with it and what does how one outrage. And Natasha in her Mint columns has been pointing about this schism that is being created among people, and now you write elsewhere, of course, Natasha. But all of that made me feel that there was something that needed doing, and something that needed doing which was meaningful. Now, at Writers in Prison Committee, for example, when a writer goes to jail, we don't go on a dharna, we don't go on a fast. We don't take out a morcha. We write letters, we write poems, we write articles, we come on sessions like this to get someone out of jail. Yesterday, I was on a panel with a writer from Uganda who was tortured recently. So it's that kind of a scenario that prompts that you need a prod to react, and yours was just the right prod, the right idea, the right sensibility behind it, an excellent group of writers that you had assembled, and so how could it was an honor and privilege to be asked. So thank you for asking me.
Not at all, Salil. I mean, you were the sort of obvious choice right off the bat. But in your piece that you write for the book, let me find the title of it. The Siberian crane doesn't live here anymore. You make a comparison between the sort of ecological and the political in some ways. You talk about the Siberian crane and its gradual disappearance from the Indian skies as a metaphor for the hostility of the Indian landscape, the increasing hostility of the Indian landscape to otherness, to outsiders. So can you tell me a little bit more about where you locate the origins of this hostility and why you think this hostility has grown?
I think, and now we are turning, not from the crane, but from the idea of India and its politics, because I'm not saying that if I say that the Siberian crane is a metaphor for the idea of India, it in fact ends up accepting the propaganda by the folks currently in power that the idea of India is an alien idea which has come in and, which we hosted and now it's time for it to go. And I don't buy that theory at all, because I go back to the Nehruvian idea that India is a palimpsest, where layer upon layer of civilization comes and falls on it. And, it makes it its own so that it's unrecognizable and uniquely Indian. So, yes, the Siberian crane and the whole controversy that got created around who is a refugee and who isn't, who gets an asylum and who doesn't. And the very fact that birds can enter without any papers. Birds don't carry passports, Siberian crane and the flamingos who come in. I grew up in Bombay and, flamingos come in winter there. And all of these things happen and there are no rules or laws against it. And India was like that. Even if India didn't sign up to the Refugee Convention, for example, you could be a Rohingya, you could be a Tamil, you could be a Tibetan, you could be an African, you could be Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, but you would get asylum. You would be welcome. India was broad enough, open enough. Barriers were not there, and that is being attacked. And that I thought was, that gave me the metaphor that I was looking for. I didn't want to write a straightforward piece which would look like an op-ed. And I think that when Nehru spoke of the kind of India which in a way builds on Tagore and builds on Gandhi and builds on all these inclusive traditions, obviously people who had never lifted their finger for India's independence, and some of them were writing apology letters, and some of them were even trying to cooperate with the British in the Quit India movement. They now want to appropriate it, and they're so devoid of heroes that they're appropriating heroes who had banned them, like Sardar Patel being one of them, and Subhash Chandra Bose, who also had no time for that kind of politics. So, it's we're talking about fake news and the inversion of reality, all that's going. So we have to hold on to certain truths. And the innocence of that bird seemed like the right way of approaching it. So I think the metaphor you picked was excellent, that when something is broken, you mend it. And you might try to make the world beautiful out of it. So all of that came together when I was working on my piece.
So in your piece, you kind of end on a note of hope, right? You say,
That's what Satyajit cinema taught me, Satyajit taught me that you have to end with hope. Whatever happens, Apu trilogy, it ends, he takes the sun on his shoulders and walks back, You have to look at the future. You have to feel brighter.
Let me read your last sort of small paragraph. It says, look at the sky. Drops of water are making our faces wet. The rain is falling. Cranes are flying, and it ends over there. So did you just end in hope because this is what Satyajit Ray taught you, or was there something more to it than that? Like, do you feel hopeful? Do you think there is cause for hope? 2.5, and this is 2 years after you actually, I think, wrote the piece, right?
No, fair enough. But if you look at the paragraph just before that, let me see if I can. I've got a small screen. So the paragraph before that will tell you why it is worth having that sort of a hope. Just once again, I only have a PDF. I don't have the hard copy yet, so I have to scroll slowly and make sure that this screen doesn't disappear. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no
Give me
worries at
1 second. And I know you know which paragraph I'm talking about, and everybody on this panel will know the paragraph, but I think it's worth recalling it because it's what we need to know.
Is it the one where it says there will
David
be rain again
said,
and the
I
train will
remember
come?
that all through history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Remember this always. And I don't have to say who said it. It was the great Gujarati, Mohandas Gandhi.
The great Indian. We all claim him, Salil.
That's fine. Okay. But anyway, so it was Gandhi who said that, and I think he said. I mean, in the film Gandhi itself, Ben Kingsley says it with a very. It comes at the end of the film after his assassination, the quote, and it has always resonated with me. That you have to I mean, hope is an ideal. To wish for it is a different matter because that's beyond your control. But otherwise, we might as well close shop and go away.
Yeah. Yeah. If I can bring Gil in at this point, Jonathan Gil Harris is the head of Department of English at the Ashoka University. He is an author of wonderful books and Shakespeare Wala extraordinaire as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Gil. Your piece in the book, it's wonderful, and it tells this sort of startling and painful story of uncovering some of your mother's secrets by going through some of the things that you found in a chest that she had always forbidden you from looking inside of. And you deploy the idea of folding and unfolding, of secrets, of pain, of memories to great effect. I'd like to quote your first paragraph. You say, there are many ways of folding a piece of paper and many motivations for folding it. One can fold it into something beautiful, an origami crane, but one can also fold it to avert one's gaze from what is contained in it. So tell us a little bit more about your piece and how you came to its subject matter.
Thank you, Pallavi. And thank you also for including me in this project. I'm a strange kind of Indian. I'm Indian and not Indian. I'm a migrant, and a very different migrant from the type that we normally speak about.
But you're a Kiwi, so a bird all the same. You fit right in.
Kiwis famously don't fly, so it was a long walk.
Special kind of Kiwi, yeah.
But as soon as you gave me this invitation, I felt a sense of not just excitement, but a sense of urgency. That this was something that I not only wanted to be involved in, but had to be involved in. Part of it was that I wanted to speak from my liminal status as an Indian who's not quite Indian. In a world where I feel, even though my voice has certain privileges by virtue of my education, my class, even my color, there are also ways in which the size of the platform from which I can speak, it feels like it's been radically shrinking. And it's also because I feel this strange sense of deja vu about what's going on now. Because so much of what I see happening in India, and frankly in many parts of the world, these were parts of what I grew. They were familiar narratives from when I was growing up. My mother is a Holocaust survivor. She was born in Poland. She narrowly escaped being deported into a concentration camp because her father took his wife and his two daughters at the very last moment across the border into Soviet-occupied Poland, where they were in Lvov. They heard, once they'd been in Lvov for a few months, that things weren't so bad in Warsaw. So they decided to go back. I mean, it seems extraordinary now that a Jewish family could have decided to go back to Warsaw in 1940, 1941. But these were the stories on the ground. The Nazis weren't so bad. We'll be fine there. So they went back. They got arrested by the Soviets at the border as anti-nationals and deported to a gulag in the Arctic Circle. And from there, they were deported again to the border of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. My mother lost both her parents there and spent the rest of the war in abject poverty. And after the war was discovered by her uncle in Palestine, who brought her over to Palestine just before Palestine was partitioned. And she lived through the partition of 1948 there. Now, the amazing thing is that my mother always refused the label of being a Holocaust survivor. And she grew up telling us that the years of the war were the happiest years of her life, which seems to be an extraordinary piece of either bad faith or disavowal. In a way, I think it was experientially true for her because she enjoyed a certain amount of freedom as outside of the straitjacket of her bourgeois home in Warsaw. Once she was in Russia and Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. But the fact is she lost both her parents. Starvation was a daily experience for her for 5 years. And so when I was growing up, I sort of had this strong sense of my mother's trauma, but it was something that we couldn't speak about, partly because of the official narrative that she had dangled out about what had happened to her during the war. The other thing that struck me as I was growing up, and it's very hard when you're small to make sense of contradictions in a parent, but you begin to sort of get a handle on these contradictions and you try and reconcile them in some way. My mother was a lifelong communist. I think I inherited my sense of social justice from her. But she was curiously, virulently Islamophobic. And I remember that her uncle had sent her to a boarding school immediately after the war in a Palestinian village where there were also Jewish settlers. And the children at her school, up to 1948, were both Palestinian and Jewish. And then the partition came along, and all of a sudden, her old Palestinian comrades became not even citizens. They were put on the other side of a border. And this border was something that functioned not only spatially and culturally, but also temporally, because all of a sudden, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims became Jews with a capital J, timeless enemy. So we'd get this narrative from my mother. She was this weird contradiction, a communist, but a hardcore Zionist. And she would say that the Palestinians are attempting to drive us into the sea. But if you ask my mother about anything that happened between 1946 and 1948, if you asked her about the children that she'd gone to school with, her eyes would well up with tears as she remembered her Palestinian friends. So there was my mother pre-1948, and there was my mother post-1948. So when you told me about the phenomenon of folding cranes, it resonated for me because, I was very interested and grateful for the opportunity to think creatively with hope about a future better than the present that we're stuck in right now. But also the very practice of folding for me was associated so strongly with my mother's refusal of certain elements of her past, whether it was her experience as a Holocaust survivor. Everything from the war was folded up in this Chinese chest that we grew up with, and we weren't allowed to look at it or touch it. Or even the memories of 1946 to 1948, where she lived with Palestinians as neighbors, as schoolmates, as friends. That got folded up, and instead we got this other creation, this narrative of Zionist Jews united against this sort of resurgent threat, existential threat to Jewish health, livelihood, welfare. So I became interested in how folding is, on the one hand, an opportunity to think creatively, to create something new. But in my own experience, folding is also a means of disavowing, of making invisible. I love what Nehru says about the palimpsest of India. But the beautiful thing about a palimpsest is that every layer is transparent. India is a palimpsest, but India is also a series of folded pieces of paper, because not every level, every layer of the palimpsest is visible. Our historical amnesia is extraordinary, and not just our historical amnesia, our ability to repudiate what's happening in front of our eyes, our ability to fold away the evidence that's being presented to us every day. That for me was the challenge, how to fold creatively, but also to critically engage the way in which we fold on a quotidian, mundane, everyday basis in order to cope with living in the world, as my mother had, as a Holocaust survivor who was still dealing with the trauma of the Holocaust as she folded this new, not so optimistic paper crane of Zionist supremacy.
Yes, and I mean, it's something we're seeing happening in India right now as well. Folding is not often creative. I think more and more we're seeing people folding away things because they don't feel safe. And so this kind of folding away and keeping of secrets, I think your piece really brings that out as, and it's very relevant to the context today. I quickly want to bring Natasha in as well. I think we have about an hour for today's discussion and a lot to get through, but I also wanted to make sure that people are aware that we will have a question and answer session at the end. So there's a chat box, I think, and you can type in your questions, and we'll save the last 10 minutes or so for an interaction with audience questions, hopefully. But Natasha is Natasha Badhwar. She's a former colleague. She's also ace filmmaker, columnist, and an entrepreneur. All kinds of amazing. But it's interesting that I have Salil on this panel and Natasha. The reason is that when I conceived of this project, I think the person who reacted with the most alacrity was probably Salil. Like, I think yours was one of the first pieces to kind of come in. They sort of flew in, whereas Natasha's was the last. And there was a considerable amount of delay and some kind of angst that went on, where for months and months I would write to you and you would say, I'm trying, and I just can't. And you seemed to be very stuck with the piece, and it seemed to take a lot out of you. So if you can tell me a little bit, because, you know, I remember you saying that you felt hopeless, you felt anxious, you kind of felt as though you didn't have words. Why did you struggle so much with this piece?
Yeah, so like Salil shared, my first response to your email, I think I responded quite quickly.
Yeah.
Because everything you said and the way in which you wanted to make sense of the kind of horror and trauma that collectively we are living through as a civilization and as a society in India. And you know, and how you wanted to make sense of it, that seemed to fit perfectly, because there were both things were happening in my personal life at that time. I was working very closely with Harsh Mandar and traveling to the homes of families of people who had been lynched publicly and videotaped, and their videos had gone viral on social media. And there'd been, you know, this resurgence of Hindutva and Hindu ideology that was very, very painful to watch. So I was engaging with it in a very direct way by actually making these journeys with a team of people, under a campaign banner called the Caravan, the Caravan of Love. And at the same time, my husband and I were raising 3 daughters, and the youngest at the same time that you had announced the crane folding project as a video on Facebook, around the same time I had shared a photo of the youngest child having folded what I think might be the smallest possible crane that can be folded out of paper. And I'd taken a photo of it and shared it on my own Facebook page. And on my palm here, it was a little dot here, and it was I could keep it here and take a photo of it. So both these things, and when she did it, I felt that I must photograph it, I must share it. There was something about the creation itself of this, and of these little hands creating a bird with so much hope and so much positivity that seemed to have a healing touch to it. So it seemed like I was living very much what you had also experienced, as you shared earlier. And then I got down to writing it, and my first reaction was, I'm so thankful that I do not have the 1,000-word limit, which is what I'd been stuck with in my column, and that I could just let myself say all the things that I hold inside that have not had an opportunity to come out. And yet the process, when I began to write, and I was sharing with you yesterday that if we just put together your emails and my responses, it's a column in itself. What I had to face up to, because I was now writing a longer essay that wanted to tell the full story of what was going on in this peace-loving society of ours. How had we turned so violently and so visibly against our own? And so to try to say all of that, to talk about having witnessed the grief of people, and to also have to deal with survivor's guilt, with the guilt of privilege, with the question, do I even have the right to tell the story? Do I even have the ability to tell this? So when I read this essay now, after I sent it to you, and I must have taken more than 5 months actually, between March and October maybe, or November. After I sent it to you, I could not read it again for a couple of months. And then later when I did, and when I do now, and none of the angst is reflected in the sentences. It just seems like, okay, yeah, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But it was like I had to feel the pain in my body, and I really had to physically feel a lot of pain before it would become a sentence and come out. So some kind of sublimation was happening. It was also because I was writing without a deadline. I didn't have to make it to a newspaper that was going. I could stay up all night with it. I could allow all these demons to come and dance around me, etc. But I'm extremely thankful to your patience, for your patience, actually.
Well, I think the book is thankful to you. Well, the book is thankful to you. But a quick follow-up question. Your children are in this piece. You talked about your daughter making the small crane as well. My children are in my piece in the introduction that I write. And I was just wondering, like, as parents, the way that we confront, process, and explain hate and othering and sort of bad things to kids. It's such a complex process. And can you talk a bit more about this challenge? I spoke at the beginning about the multiplicity of my own identities. And in your piece, you talk about your daughter Alisa and how you come across a diary entry in which she writes that I am a Hindu, I am a Muslim, I am an Indian, and I love Harry Potter. I love that. But if you can sort of talk a little bit about being a parent in these times.
Yeah, so I certainly didn't know what I was signing up for, to be honest, because all the years that, my now husband and then boyfriend were together, the fact that he's a Muslim and I'm a Hindu was the smallest detail. It was not something that was that in any way seemed to be significant to me. And it did become a little significant because we got married in 2002, and we got married right after the carnage in Gujarat took place. And I suspect we even got married in reaction to that. It kind of woke us up to the fact that this love is not allowed, that there are people who want to say this is not possible, we will not let it happen. And are we going, do we have it in us to show a different reality? And I it's a very, very personal choice. When you marry who you marry, you don't think it's in any way intertwined with the story of your country. But sometimes these things do connect. And actually listening to the stories of Salil and Gil, they connect all the time, to be honest. We just have to open our eyes and see it. We would say, oh, you're doing something very brave. And we'd say there's nothing brave about it. And then, of course, we had children. And I didn't think there was any conflict, So sure, they can have Diwali and they can have Eid and they can do Holi and they can have birthday parties and read whatever they like to read. But we find ourselves more and more living in times where identity is contested on a daily basis, literally on a daily basis. I mean, gender, the rights of your gender are contested. Your privilege doesn't protect you anymore. And the children began to bring the conversations home. They began to bring the conversation home from school. And that's when I became aware of how much these debates had become drawing room conversations in the homes of other children that my children were studying with, because they would come to the home and say, I've been told that you cannot be Hindu and Muslim both. And they would have to kind of rehearse their lines before going back and saying, I can choose to be what I am. And I suppose when she's writing that diary entry, she's just 9 years old at that time. She's just expressing herself. She's making a list of everything she is, everything that matters to her. By now, I think it's too late. They are far more clued into, their prediction for whether the world will heal their prognosis is much worse than mine. So I am dealing now with teenagers who in many ways have less hope, do not have hope, want to wake me up and tell me it's not going to get better in the way, the pandemic won't be over next year and everything won't come back to normal. What we have seen of our governance is not going to change. So we're almost holding each other's hand now as we go forward. I learned from them and they learned from me. And I think that overall we'll emerge more resilient because we still have to be around when it's time to mend and rebuild.
Well, that's very sobering that young people seem to have lost hope. And I mean, very much part of this book was an act of hope and it was an act of reclamation. But like I said, in the 2.5 years since I first conceived of it, I have not had that much cause for hope myself. But Salil, if I...
Can I jump in?
Yes.
An anecdote. I mean, I have to pick up for hope if we are going to be so full of... the despair is absolutely justified. So Don't get me wrong. But during the Shaheen protests,
Yeah.
one of our mutual friends, I'm not sure whether she wrote this in public or not, so I won't name her now. But she was there as a volunteer, right? And Hindu by birth and so on. And uh, she she feels very depressed and very downbeat about the whole thing. And she saw all these very young people, working as volunteers and enthusiastic. And one of them actually, and my Hindi is terrible. I'm Gujarati, as you know. So, but said something to the effect of, "Don't worry, auntie, hum sab kuch theek kar denge." Your generation may have messed, and my son,
Messed it up.
my older son, is far more aware of the climate issues than I am, and he has the headspace for it. That you guys have screwed it up, but we will try to fix it. And I love that spirit, and I mean, I'm not saying that it's going to be all crazy and wonderful, but if we want to get there, we have to cling to that hope and move forward. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
I hope so, but I think in some senses, we all grew up in quite an idealistic context, and like that partly because of our education and just the movies we would watch, and there was a sort of idealism that was part of the nation building of India that had carried on into our youth, and that has gone. And so I think young people today they're not exposed to that at all, and that's worrying to me. But something perhaps for all of you quickly before we open up. We've been talking a lot about fighting with words. I've talked about being an army, the best that we can be as writers. And I was again sort of brought up on all these phrases like the power of the word and the pen is mightier than the sword, all of these sentiments. But do you think that these might just sort of betray my own myopic prejudices as a writer, as a sort of insignificant elite that is puffed up with its own importance and blind in some ways to their own impotence? Because if we want to fight for an India where pluralism is really part of the national metaphysics, what must we do beyond write, and who are we writing for? Because of course I feel very much this frustration that one is preaching to the choir. I don't know who are the people logged on today, but I doubt there's many people logged on today who don't already agree with what we are trying to say. So I guess the real challenge is not expressing ourselves but actually changing minds with words. And is that with cranes, with words? I don't know. I mean, are these sort of impotent, futile gestures, or is there something more? What can we really be doing? Can we do a quick round, maybe starting with Salil, then Gil, and then Natasha answering this?
So, it's always the hard part. You do what you are good at, right? I'm not a lawyer, so I can't file wonderful cases of the kind that Prashant Bhushan or Indira Jaising or any of the great human rights lawyers in India fight. I mean, more power to them. I'm not an organizer, so I can't be a Medha Patkar and get people and rally around an issue. I don't have the energy of Harshmander, and go to all parts of India and build things. But the very fact that these names that I randomly pick up, I'm not a historian like Rovila Thapar who can say that, look, this is what history was, this is what teaches us, and this is where we should be heading towards. But I think if we can remind ourselves of that, and if we can try to say that these are not isolated dots, but they can be connected, and what gets connected is not some kind of it's not a Rorschach test that I'm giving people, but actually what emerges will be very beautiful. And even from something broken, something beautiful can happen. I mean, this is what I did want to bring up in this conversation. So I do want to, because Hiroshima is the main metaphor. The other wonderful Japanese word, kinsukuroi, which many people which is that when something is broken, you meld it with gold. You put gold in it so that you're aware that there was a fragility. It did break down, but then what you enhanced its beauty by adding gold to it. And I think we do it with words. Other people will do it with art. Shilpa Gupta and others who are doing with their art, trying to heal wounds. And I think those voices have to be there. The sane voices from Bollywood have to take it at a step beyond, because they historically did it so well in India, talking about the India of the 1950s and the progressive when the theaters have been doing. So I think, and if these voices get reinforced, others will think that, look, it's not just me. There is a wider currency and there is a wider movement, and that is the silent majority, which will speak up. Because all said and done, if we look at the percentage of votes those who want to divide are fewer than those who want to stay united.
Gil?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm Jewish, so I'm temperamentally much more pessimistic. But you know, I abide very much by Gramsci's dictum: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. There's, for me, very little to derive hope from intellectually, but like Salil, I feel we need to cling somehow to hope. I mean, one thing that's been brought home to me with abundant clarity over the last, well, really the last 6 years, but especially the last 2 years, is the fact that even though English is the aspirational language of India and has a great deal of social capital, it's not the language of social change. And I think I immigrated to India at a time when my fellow English speakers believed themselves to be the natural rulers of the country, and felt that what was spoken about and communicated in English would have this sort of extraordinary trickle-down effect. And we're seeing the limits of that. I do think that a lot of what is happening outside of English, and thank God for that. But at a smaller level, I also feel that the Jewish ideal of tikkun, of repair, is something that I hold very close. Jews assume the world is broken, and we have an ethical imperative to repair it. Now, that doesn't mean putting it together in the way it used to be. It doesn't mean creating a golden past. But it does mean using whatever ability you have to make it a little bit better than it was before. And I feel like every day I step into the classroom, I'm seeing tikkun happen, not because of my efforts, but because I'm in the presence of students who are coming into their voice and are allowing themselves to stay on the left-hand side of the question mark. They're allowing themselves to live with certainty, anxiety, to ask difficult questions of the world, of power. And if that attitude, it doesn't matter what language it happens in, if that attitude can somehow spread, then we might have something to hope for, rather than a new generation of foot soldiers who just in docile yet militant fashion, do what they're told and goose step according to the beat that is being drummed for them.
Natasha.
Yeah, so one of the last lines in my piece is: the healthiest psychological response to alarming information is action. You know, one of the big milestones of healing is to realize your own power. So in a way, it's very important for each one of us to not diminish our own power and to see ourselves as whole. I mean, none of us are only writing or, you know, only submitting essays a week. Gil is working with students. You're bringing up writers together to create a book that will create conversations. I'm constantly being told, are you a journalist or an activist? And I'm like, you're not going to push me back and tell me that I have to choose between one or the other. I'm going to be, you know, all of these. And Salil's working so hard to fight for the rights of, you know, free speech for writers, freedom of speech for writers. So it's very, very important. And I think that my response to my children's pessimism when I'm confronted by it is to live by example. You know, is to let them see me sit up late at night, finish a film, and wake up early in the morning and post it everywhere on social media and come back to check what impact it had, or who picked it up, or who took it where. And similarly, you know, we get hope from the new generation. We get hope, like Salil and Gil shared, from the power of people who will not be defeated by those in authority. So yeah, hope is always with us.
So, I've been getting several comments, and then there have been a few people who are asking if they can ask questions, and in order to do that, do they have to type? And the answer to that is yes. You have to type in the chat box. Otherwise, I won't be able to see them. We can't actually have you speak on the panel, unfortunately. So please go ahead and type any questions that you might have. In the meantime, I thought that perhaps we should sort of go back a little bit to the actual book, because it has such a multiplicity of wonderful voices, and maybe read a couple of the poems out quickly. They're short and punchy. And Gil, I think you said that you had wanted to read one by our Kashmiri writer, who's a young writer, who's actually also a poet and a lyricist, and he has a rock band as well called Alif, and he wants to set this poem to music later on and actually sing a song around it, which I think is wonderful. But I think he's one of our youngest contributors. So if you would read that out, please, Gil.
So this poem is called Korkun, which is Kashmiri for which way. And the poet is Mohammed Munim. I asked, the middle, which way? I'm drowning to the left and right. Which way? The darkness is seeking me on every street. I would grope for the sun, but which way? When my death clock strikes, they will look for me. But I'm already lost and don't know which way. I may be no scholar, but with fire I let my blood burn my being. I shrug off their taunts, but which way? The white paper crane asked me, who are you? What is Aleph? I replied, I'm the artisan of every thought. Which way?
Natasha, that's beautiful. Do you have a poem?
Yeah. So I'm going to read Gopika Jadeja's Cranes in Persian or Urdu.
So Gopika was actually a writer I didn't know about. Salil introduced me to her, and she's done an absolutely wonderful poem for us.
When you imagine them, the cranes did not make their whoops in a language I know, neither Persian nor Urdu. My tongue mimics the sonic shapes of Devanagari, the troughs and crests of a script that flows like water, a language I have lost. I never heard it from you, but it was always your voice when mother recited it, my first lesson in exile and loss, the poem about migratory cranes returning home. Your cadence punctuated the sound of the arrow that found the wing of the Saras, its fall, slow motion to earth. A first lesson in violence, the lines describing the hunter and the hunted. Smell of blood and love as the Saras fell, its mate hovering above. No possibility of a return home. The flock paused mid-flight, home written on wings. The air aflutter before the rush of wings fleeing arrows. Like you, I borrow words, make them speak in a different tongue. Yet, I cannot translate into words the wounds and the wounded. Maybe it needs no translation. In your voice, my mother reciting through her tears, I see that you knew the wound is the place the light enters.
That's from Rumi, isn't it? The wound is the place where the light enters you. Yeah. Okay, so very quickly, I'll read out some of the comments. We have fascinating conversation. What is the world we are leaving for our children? Wonderful. At the same time, noting the young holding hands and moving ahead in despair. There's a question about the uniform civil code in India and whether this is something that we should be implementing. And another question saying, given the condition of hatred, have you also found processes of dialogues between Hindu fundamentalists and forces of embrace and coexistence? Regarding words, how have you felt about the work of words with you, both politically and spiritually? Would any of you like to respond to some of these comments or questions? Perhaps Salil?
Okay,
Putting you in the hot seat, sorry. Yeah.
Sure.
You want to
No,
talk about you want to talk about the Uniform Civil Code?
I'll try to, because
Okay.
there are two aspects to it, right? One is that we live and let people live as they are, and not interfere with the way they want to lead their lives. But there is a good there are two comments I want to make about Uniform Civil Code. The first is the broader one, that's a wonderful principle to have, and but at the same time, if the implementation of those specific laws and practices lead to violation of other people's rights, then there's a problem. So if there is a particular system which leads to subjugation of a specific minority, it could be a caste, it could be a language group, it could be a sex, it could be gender, that is a problem. So yes, people should be able to eat what they want, drink what they want, and all that is fine, but not in a way that actually causes physical harm to people, not offense. Offense is a different thing. I mean, if I say something stupid about you, you can say something stupid about me. That's okay. But anything that specifically prevents other people from exercising their rights, it's wrong, because it comes from religion, and religion is an idea. It is not an entity. That's one part of it. The other part is when the conversation in India with civil code tends to be about, basically mirroring the Hindu code, that the way Hindus live, the majoritarian view becomes a national view. And that is a problem, because Buddhists don't feel like that, Jains don't feel like that. Forget about, let's not get into the whole M word and talk about how Muslims feel about it. But there are other faiths which have moved away from Hinduism because they are not happy with the way it is. And what is Hinduism? I mean, it's so divided. So which code are we talking about? So we can start talking about it if we are going to check at the India's income tax code and reframe the Hindu undivided family as a policy. Which gives exemption. If we are going to have that kind of an adult, mature conversation and look at it from the perspective of rights, then I think it's a conversation worth having. Otherwise, we are just playing to the gallery that is very popular just now.
We have a few other questions that have come up. One is, how do you speak to those unwilling to listen? I think that's something we actually touched upon earlier, and all of us made a kind of stab at getting at that. But I think, yes, that kind of gets to the crux of one of the biggest problems that we face. Another one by Himanshu Chawla saying, voices of intellectuals and academics have been suppressed by lies being propagated by a host of agencies, including political parties, on social media. How to counter that? So I guess talking about the trolls and sort of the vicious tone of a lot of the trolling that goes on social media. How does one counter that? It's such a force, social media today, more so than mainstream media in many ways. Natasha, would you like to perhaps respond to that?
Yeah, I was, of course, there's trolling. I was just thinking to myself that one of the things this kind of this creation of binaries does is that it steals nuance. It takes away nuance from you. We are now sitting on so much rage and anger because there's been so much violence, on imagined and real violence on both sides of the political divide, of the ideological divide, the religious divide, that you hear somebody say something that you're ideologically opposed to, and you want to cross out the entire person. And every story has ever shown you, every good film, book, poem, essay has ever conveyed to you is that we are all nuanced people, that your uncle who bores you to death with telling you what the RSS believes in is also the kindest man, who will be the only person by the hospital bed of another relative when they need help. And it is not, what we have to save ourselves from is not falling in the trap where we just become enemies of each other and cannot reach out to each other anymore. So whether we're being trolled or trolling others, what we need to do is reclaim language and reclaim etiquette. That's what somebody comes too strongly on us, and you feel that you have the right to respond in the same way. But you remind yourself, and I suppose this is the solution we all find constantly of how do we speak to people who don't agree with us, is that we tell our stories, we tell us those stories in as nuanced a way as possible, with as much humility as possible, with as much honesty as possible, and that's a resistance.
It's just that concepts like etiquette and nuance seem like in an alternative universe to the kind of things that we see on Twitter. And, it almost sounds like we're speaking another language. And this, again,
But
ends
we're
up
not
being
going
one
to
of the
give up
great...
on it.
Yeah. Gil, would you have any thoughts on the whole social media phenomenon and how that's kind of played into amplifying hatred, and how then you can, if you can use that also to reclaim plurality, as this book is an attempt?
Well, my answer is fairly short. I've got off.
We are running out of time.
I've got off all social media because I think that well is unfortunately irredeemably poisoned. I need to, for my own mental health, I cannot be accosted every day by what Twitter or Facebook has to say. So I think, yeah. So I believe in old-fashioned social media, which is talking with people face to face. And it's amazing how much crap people will say behind the literal screen of their laptop that they won't say face to face. There's something about being able to see someone else's body, their body language, see their eyes, their heart. That means it's not simply that you're stopping yourself from saying what the noxious things you think. It's also that you are moderating that noxiousness in the presence of another. I know it doesn't always happen, but I think we need to find more ways of actually being in the same space physically as those we disagree with. And unfortunately, the pandemic is doing so much to exacerbate the kind of screened media. I don't call it social media, I call it screened media. That means people can scream and scream into the void at each other ad nauseam. We seem to have lost the connection there.
Pallavi, it seems, is frozen.
Yes, we're back. I think everybody's back now. Sorry, say that again, Salil.
No, I just thought you were muted, but you're not.
No, not muted. There seems to be a slight connection problem, and Natasha has disappeared as well. But very quickly, we're going to be wrapping up the session now. In any case, although we very kindly been given an extra 10-15 minutes by the IIC, so we still have 5 minutes. But the problem I feel like with social media is that trolls are so relentless and just seem to have this sort of endless fund of energy to spread viciousness and hatred, and this kind of persistence that it drives everybody else out. I mean, like you said, Gil, you've left social media, and I think most people end up either leaving social media or muting it, or exiting the space altogether, because they just simply cannot continue to engage with that kind of relentlessness and keep their mental health and sanity intact. And so it does end up being, if that ends up being an important battleground, and I unfortunately think that today it is, it's almost like, we are fighting guns with some old-fashioned samurai weapons at our disposal, which are just very mismatched. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much more there is to say at that. However, I do think that poets should always have the last word. And we had a couple of poems from the anthology read out already by Gil and Natasha. And if I may, I would like to end this session by reading a poem by Sumana Roy, which is called Boneless Bird. I'm folding paper to give it spine. Cartilage is an heirloom that paper doesn't inherit. Paper, as boneless as the mind. Between my fingers is a printed map, stiff as if it were a slap of air hardened from waiting. Kashmir touches Sri Lanka's forehead. Bombay embraces a hut in Arunachal. I keep folding the map. Countries become intimate as they can only during war, keeping their soft parts away, as if only hardness wins battles. I am still folding, and a stubble of paper bones begins to limp. Flight needs bones, bones and air. Paper is too skinny, it needs sleep. Sleep's muscle, its tyranny, its pavement, its weightless care. I pause. I want to be gentle, like eyelashes, like tendril. But working my fingers is the herd of time. Maps cannot hold skies, only its shy water is blue. And so I begin folding again. I pinch, I stroke, I pat, I blow. Foo, foo. The bird doesn't fly. I can't give it the sweetness of air. Origami can't give it will. The world flattens its dimensions, it squats, then falls. Air has lost its salt. Even lifeless birds can't sit still. So we end this session, the launch of this book, giving it wings, sending our cranes, our wishes, and our hopes out into the world today. I wanted to thank all of you and the rest of the contributors for having come on this journey with me. And I hope we can continue to have some of these conversations in the coming months going forward. I wanted to also thank everybody who's actually attended today. I know it's at different times and time zones. So, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you might be. Thank you again to the IIC. And yes, I think we need to wrap it up now. We're already beyond time, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Thank you, Pallavi, for bringing this wonderful collection together. And it's a privilege to be a part of it. Thank you.
Ditto. Thank you.